Hello and good morning, MYM Insiders. How you doing today? This is Rich Harshaw, and we are here for our strategic marketing webinar. And we're going to get a little bit back to the basics today, going back to some of the MYM methodology. Haven't covered a lot of this in a while, but I think it's good to get back and teach you how to write some headlines. You know, I was just having a conversation the other day with a client, and I was talking about the importance of headlines. And my opinion is that headlines do about 75 to 80% of the heavy lifting in all marketing communications. And this is made clear when you look at some of the marketing that we write. We always take headlines and we do what's called a headline stack, or we create a headline funnel. And the headline funnel is there to allow the reader to see what goes first, what the topic is, and then go into the second and third headlines to get more and more clear picture of what they can expect to find in this marketing piece. And I wrote an article that was published today about 3 hurdles that have to be overcome in 8 seconds, and a lot of that has to do with headlines. So we're going to talk about John Smith headlines. There's different ways to write headlines that we talk about in the MYM methodology, but this one I think is probably the most critical to master, because this is the one that really forces you to see the world through John Smith's eyes. And at the end of the day, if you want to understand how to write good marketing, it all comes down to seeing the world through John Smith's eyes, okay? We've got to be able to see the world through John Smith's eyes. We can't just write things that seem interesting to us. We've got to be able to put ourselves in that position to be able to not just see, but think and feel what John Smith is seeing, thinking, and feeling when he encounters a given situation. And that's what we're going to practice doing today. We're going to try to capture that and put it into headlines. So let's talk about how to really get inside John Smith's head. Let's back up and talk about the reticular activating system. This is something we used to talk about a whole lot in the MYM system. We don't talk about it quite so much anymore because we're a little bit more focused recently on offering services, and we just create things for our clients. But when you get into the heavy-duty training on how to actually do this, the reticular activator and some of these fundamental psychological concepts become really, really important. So the reticular activator, just by way of review for many of you, but maybe by way of first time for some of you, it's the attention center in the brain. It's the center of motivation, complex collection of neurons which serves as the convergence points for signals, blah, blah, blah. Here's what it means. It's the part of your brain where the world outside of you and your thoughts and feelings inside of you meet, okay? Reticular activator is the part of your brain that notices stuff. It's like a radar. If you've seen on a movie, maybe there's a plane that's flying and you got this radar and it goes around in a circle, and when it hits that part where that plane is, it does a beep. This is what the reticular activating system does. Reticular activator, reticular activating system, it's the same thing. And here's what happens. Your brain is constantly on the lookout 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even when you're asleep, for things that are familiar, unusual, or problematic. When it finds something that fits into those categories of familiar, unusual, or problematic, then it's going to ping the brain. The external stimuli is going to ping the brain and say, hey, here's something that you might want to pay closer attention to. It's what allows us to not constantly notice everything that's going on around us. I don't know what it's called, but I've heard stories about some sort of a disorder where people are overstimulated and they literally notice everything around them, and it becomes an overwhelming condition in their lives where it's very hard to function in a normal life. The reticular activating system, which allows you to not have that happen. It allows you to notice only the things that are important and relevant and interesting and worth some sort of conscious activity on your part. Otherwise, again, like I just alluded to, you'd be constantly bombarded with stimuli that weren't meaningful, that weren't actionable, and it would overwhelm you. So this is what the reticular activating system does, okay? Now, here's the keys to find out what's inside John Smith's brain and then put that into marketing. When we put ourselves in John Smith's shoes, looking through his eyes and feeling what he's feeling. So what we want to do is we want to be able to understand what kinds of things are familiar, unusual, or problematic. If we can do that, then we're going to land what we call a John Smith reticular activator bullseye, okay? So let me give you an example via story. I used to tell this story all the time. This is kind of a fun, interesting flashback webinar for me. So this is going all the way back to 2001, and my wife had just had our 4th child, and we eventually made it up to 6. But we had a minivan at the time, and we needed a bigger vehicle so that we could fit all 4 of these kids and put them far enough apart so that they wouldn't touch each other and all that kind of stuff. My oldest at the time was just 8 years old. So anyway, we went out and we bought a Ford Excursion. It was the biggest vehicle we could think of. It was 7,200 pounds, had an infinity number of seats in it. It was just a huge behemoth of a vehicle. And I called my car guy because I hate shopping for cars, and I had a guy that I would just call, and he would go find what I wanted for me. And I said, I want the Ford Excursion. He said, okay. And he asked me about the equipment and the options and stuff like that. And he finally asked me, what color do you want? And I said, well, I don't know what color I want. What are the options? And he said, well, there's, the white one, and he went through several colors, and I said, I don't know, I kind of like to have things that are a little bit different. He said, well, what about green? Do you want green? And I said, ooh, green sounds interesting. And he says, well, there's 2 greens. And I said, well, what are they? He said, well, one of them is sort of an evergreen, dark, sort of Eddie Bauer color green. And I said, oh, that sounds pretty good. And he says, well, there's this other one. He said, I don't know what it's called, but it's sort of an army green. It's kind of ugly. And I said, that's the one I want. And he goes, well, why would you want that thing? And I said, well, I just want to have something a little bit different. Plus, my wife's going to drive it. Who cares? So I got this car, and it was this huge green beast of a car. And so my kids, this was back in the days of Shrek, was a popular motion picture. So they started calling this Shrek. So literally, instead of getting into the car to go somewhere, they would say, let's get in Shrek. And so it was. We had Shrek. And we had this car for several years until, I guess we had it until about 2012, finally gave out. Well, here was the interesting thing. When we first got this Shrek, I remember driving it to Home Depot one time. I was sitting out front of Home Depot. I had all the kids in the car. My wife had run in to grab a couple things and didn't want to haul all the kids inside, so I sat in the car with them. As I was sitting in the parking lot of Home Depot, here comes a car driving by. And sure enough, it's another big, ugly, army color green Shrek. And I'm thinking, wow, look at that. Somebody else bought this dumb thing. And then a few minutes later, not the same one, but a different Shrek comes driving by. And by the time we were done sitting there, I'd been sitting there for about 15 minutes by the time it was all said and done. I think she was getting some paint. 3 Shreks drove by. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, who are these idiots that would buy this ugly, ugly vehicle? And my question for you is, have you had that same situation before where you've bought a new car and then you suddenly realize that everybody else has bought the same make, model, style, color, identical car as you? And the reason is this. If you go back to our definition of reticular activating system, your brain is constantly on the lookout 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for things that are familiar, problematic, or unusual, then here's what happens. Because that Shrek, in my situation, was familiar to me, it was something that was new and familiar and something that was on my mind, my brain would pick it out of the crowd. There might have been 2,000-3,000 cars in that vicinity at the time, and because 3 of them were the same, I picked those out. Whereas under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have noticed that car. Or stated differently, I would not have noticed other types of cars that came by that area. Okay? This is the reticular activating system. So here's what we're trying to do in this whole John Smith headline thing is we're trying to find out what things are familiar, unusual, and problematic. We call these things hot buttons. And we're trying to find out what they are so that we can put them into the marketing, talk about them in the marketing, allude to them in the marketing, say things about them in the marketing, so that when John Smith is reading or otherwise watching television, looking in their mailbox, listening to the radio, whatever the case is, their brain will pick these things out as something that is familiar, unusual, or problematic, and it'll signal John Smith, hey, you need to pay attention to this thing. That's how you make money in marketing, is by understanding this reticular activating system concept, okay? So the first step to this, though, is we've got to understand what's in John Smith's brain. If you don't know that I've got a green Shrek on my brain, then it's very difficult for you to put a green Shrek purposefully in my path. Obviously, that's not a marketing scenario, but what is a marketing scenario is finding things that are familiar, unusual, and problematic, and then putting them in the path of John Smith so that they trigger that radar and allow John Smith to say, hey, let me take a closer look at this and see if it's something I'm interested in, okay? So as we look at John Smith headlines, here's what we're going to do. It's a little methodology. It's pretty simple. This guy on the right-hand side represents John Smith. I don't know if that's John Smith or not, but it's the best cartoon I could find at the time. The idea here is to capture exactly what John Smith is thinking. Okay, now it's important to distinguish where he is on the educational spectrum. We've got three categories of hot buttons here: benefits of ownership, objections to ownership, vendor selection, right? By the way, I don't think I was sitting in front of Home Depot in that last story. I think I was sitting in front of Lowe's, but whatever. Lowe's is better. The benefits of ownership, objections to ownership, and vendor selection. And I'm not going to go over this in detail because this is a different topic for a different webinar, but there are three different categories of hot buttons. Benefits of ownership are reasons why John Smith would want to buy what you sell in the first place. Objections to ownership are reasons why John Smith would not want to buy what you sell in the first place. Vendor selections are reasons why John Smith would want to buy what you sell from you instead of from somebody else. Break each of these components down into hot buttons. Okay, now let's do this for a hypothetical scenario, which is daycare. Hang on. Excuse me. It is very difficult to sneeze on a webinar and get away with it, especially when you admit it. Okay, so here's the vendor selection hot button. Now remember, vendor selection, what I just said a minute ago, are hot buttons that describe why John Smith, your prospect, would want to buy from you instead of somebody else, okay? And these are some example hot buttons from the industry of daycare. Now just think about this for a minute. If you were trying to find a daycare to put your kid in, these are some of the things that would be important and relevant to you. The quality of instructors, the teacher-child ratio, learning versus just playing. There's got to be a, you know, some sort of a fine line there. You want them to have some fun, but you also want them to learn, and not all or none of one or the other, right? The facilities would make a difference. What you feed them would make a difference. So let's take some of these and let's go through this process, okay? Put yourself in John Smith's shoes. Now here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine a one-panel cartoon with John Smith in it. Now imagine that he's in a situation where he's frustrated. Now here's the key. What kind of situation? And I'm going to go backwards on this slide real quick, okay? Based on quality of instructors, or teacher-child ratio, or learning versus just playing, or facilities, or diet and nutrition. And we can do this for each of these, but we need to do them sequentially. We need to do them one at a time, okay? So put him in a situation where he's frustrated. So maybe this learning versus playing. Does anybody ever remember the movie with Will Smith called Pursuit of Happiness? And he was a single father. I think it was taking place something like in the 70s. And he took his son to daycare, but it was a really, really bad, cheap, crummy daycare, and all they did was put him in front of the TV all day, and all he ended up doing was watching TV. He never learned a single thing. And he found out by his son singing the theme songs from a bunch of TV shows, and he realized, man, my son's learning nothing at daycare. And that's where he's frustrated, okay? And this is what we want to do. We want to picture John Smith in this frustrated state and in the situation, and here's what we want to know right here. What would he be saying or thinking? That's your John Smith statement right there. That's your John Smith statement. Write it out in first person. Write it as if John Smith were saying it to himself or to maybe a spouse or somebody nearby, a friend, okay? It can be a statement or a question. Let me give you some examples, okay? So let's use quality of instructors or staff for our first hot button, okay? So imagine John Smith in a situation where he is displeased, frustrated, with the quality of the instructor or the staff. Now think about this for a minute. This shouldn't be that hard for you to do. Now I've got a lot of kids. I don't have any experience with daycare because I haven't put them in daycare, but I can certainly imagine this. It's not that hard of a stretch to think, okay, I've got my kid. She's 2 years old, 1 year old, whatever the case is, and she's in daycare. And there's something about the quality of the instructor or the staff that is frustrating me. What would I say? Well, maybe I would say that girl barely looks old enough to take care of herself, let alone my daughter. Or it looks like this daycare is background check optional. Or that this year at daycare, my son learned that neck tattoos are cool. Maybe that's the problem that I'm having with the staff or instructor. Or I wonder if they perform background checks on these people. Or those daycare's workers look nice enough, but are they really trustworthy? Okay, are you following me? Now, what I did not do prior to writing these headlines is I did not describe and discuss with you on this call in detail what the problems were. I'm going to let you figure out what those problems are, and then we want to write headlines addressing them. So we can do a what do you call it? A reverse engineer on this. You can see that in the first one, maybe it's that the daycare worker looks very, very young. She doesn't look qualified. The second one, maybe they just look kind of like a sketchy person, and maybe they would fail a background check. Okay. The third one, somebody has a neck tattoo. That would be something that would be I would find unappealing as a parent. Perhaps number 4, again, sketchy people that don't look that great. These daycare workers look nice enough, but are they really trustworthy? Maybe something happened that made me feel that they weren't trustworthy. Okay. So these are the John Smith headlines for the hot button. Quality of instructor daycare. Let's go through another example, okay? This one is the staff-child ratio. Now, for the staff-child ratio, we would be frustrated if we felt like there were too many children and not enough staff, right? I mean, I don't know what the appropriate staff-child ratio is, but, 520 to 1 is probably too many kids for one instructor. 2 to 1 is probably overkill. So I don't know. Let's see what would happen. How about this? I don't want my son to be treated like a number. Or, there are so many other children running around, those workers look like they're going crazy. Or, will my son get loving attention at daycare? Or, my gosh, it looks like they've got Johnny in there with 50 other kids. Okay, now, I made a comment earlier that I kind of went past quickly, and I want to bring it back out to you now, which is these John Smith statements, these John Smith headlines can be stated either in the form of a statement, like number 1, 2, and 4, or they can be stated in the form of a question, like number 3. It doesn't really matter, because what we're going to do in a few minutes is we're actually going to take the statements and we're going to turn them into questions, and we're going to take the questions and we're going to turn them into statements. And you might be thinking, well, why on earth would we do that? That sounds confusing. Well, just stick with me. It's just a little preview. We haven't really gotten there yet. We'll get there in a minute. Let's continue to write some more headlines. So the headline, we're still talking about daycare. And now let's talk about learning versus just playing. Okay? So think about this. What situation would John Smith be in that he would feel frustrated by this learning versus just playing? And I sort of described one earlier from the movie Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith. So let's take a look. Seems like all they do is watch TV and play all day. Now, this is not a particularly caustic way to state this. He's not saying, oh my blanking gosh, I can't believe all they blanking do is watch blanking TV and play blanking games all day. I could write it more caustically with a little bit more emotional oomph, but I'm not really that worried about that. I'm more worried about just capturing what the situation is, because if indeed John Smith is frustrated by this, then it will capture their reticular activator regardless of the emotion used, okay? Now, let's take a step back for a second. Everybody just kind of put your pencils down, focus on the teacher for a minute, don't look at your screen. I want you to think about this with me for a second. Everything we're doing here has an end, which means that everything that we're doing here currently is a means to an end, okay? We are not writing headlines so that we can have headlines. We are writing headlines so that we can put them into marketing. And the reason that we're putting them into marketing is so that we can most efficiently and effectively capture people, make sure that they become interested, read what we have to say, get interested in what we have to say, and then take action based on what we say. So headlines in and of themselves are not the end. Getting people to pay attention to us and take action is the end. Headlines are the means, okay? Are you with me so far? That being said, here's what we've got to think about and consider and ponder for a minute. If I write a headline about learning versus just playing, and it has something to do with people sitting around watching TV all day and playing games all day instead of learning, then I have to understand the marketplace at large that I'm going after, which is parents of daycare-age kids who are currently either interested in or frustrated by the current situation that they have with their current daycare. And if I start talking about something that is not actually a problem, or that is not currently on people's minds, or is something that they don't have any issue with, then it's not going to work. Are you following what I'm saying? So I guess what I'm trying to say is this. If there are sufficiently large numbers of people who are concerned about the learning experience versus the playing experience of their children while they're in daycare, then this is the type of headline that might work to capture somebody's interest because it's something that they're already, reticular activator, thinking about. And if it is not, then guess what? I probably should choose a different hot button that is more likely to hit the mark. Okay? Are you following me on all that? The problem I have when I train on this is the curse of knowledge. I know all this stuff very well because I've been looking at it, studying it, training on it, dissecting it for years and years and years and years, and this is perhaps the first, second, or third time that you've been hearing it. So I want you to keep this in mind. It's so easy to get focused on headlines and think that the headline is what you're trying to accomplish, which, yes, you need to write a headline, but it is a means to an end. Context is the most important thing. Is the headline, is the topic, is the thing I'm talking about even important in the first place? Because here's what I'll tell you. Instead of getting all emotional, and emotional headlines are good, but I am the most concerned about making sure that I'm covering the right topic in the headline, because if I am, the reticular activator will take over from there. See, in that parking lot, when I was sitting at Lowe's, I did not have to see a green Ford Excursion that was on fire for me to notice it. Fire symbolizing in this example something that is very emotional and very interesting and unusual to look at, okay? And I didn't have to see a Ford Excursion that was jacked up with monster wheels or that had neon lights coming out the bottom or huge music pounding out of the back of it. All I had to see was the regular old Ford Excursion, just like mine, with regular people driving the regular version of the car, and it popped my reticular activator because it was familiar, okay? Do you understand the difference? And you say, well, it's a Ford Excursion. People are going to notice it. No, it doesn't matter. You could be driving a champagne-colored Honda Accord, and you're going to notice all the other 13,000 champagne-colored Honda Accords on the road because it's the brain science that's working in your favor here, not the extravagance or the weirdness or the unusualness or the craziness. Now, craziness does have its place because it hits the part of the reticular activator that's looking for things that are unusual and problematic, and that's okay. This is why you see commercials on television that feature all kinds of weird, unusual, crazy things like talking babies and stampeding wildebeests, etc. But what I want to make sure is that what I'm talking about in my headline is relevant and interesting to the prospect, and it speaks to something within the topic that I am trying to sell. So if I have a stampeding wildebeest and a talking baby, but it doesn't really connect to what I'm selling, then that becomes a problem also, okay? So let's go back to our exercises here. I thought for sure Johnny would have learned his alphabet and numbers by now. Where did Johnny learn all the theme songs for the sitcoms? I'm not expecting Harvard, but I would like them to teach Susie something. Next hot button. Facilities. I'm tired of Johnny complaining about there being nothing to do at daycare. It would be nice if they had big playgrounds and a big library, computers, and lots of toys to play with. They need enough stuff to keep a bunch of active toddlers busy all day. The facilities at the daycare are all run down and crusty, okay? These are based on potential problems that I might have at the daycare with the facilities, okay? I'm talking about the hot button facilities. Next, diet and nutrition. Mommy, the food they give me at daycare is yucky. Since when is PB&J one of the 4 major food groups? Would it be asking too much to give kids some variety in their menu? My Susie is such a picky eater, I'm afraid she'll starve to death at daycare. Okay? Got it? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to transform these. We're going to take them from an ugly, caterpillar and transform them into a beautiful butterfly, so to speak. And here's how we do this. Transformation process. We take the statement or the question and we reverse it, okay? And here's what this means. Remember I said earlier that we had an ability to choose either a statement or a question when we first write the John Smith statement. It doesn't matter if you first write it as a statement or a question, because what we're going to do is we're going to transform it from one to the other. We're going to reverse it. So if my original is, since when is PB&J one of the 4 major food groups, now your task is this. Turn that into a statement. Can you do it? Go ahead and try right now. I wasn't aware that PB&J was one of the 4 major food groups. Do you see how one's a question and one's a statement? Now, here's what is happening right now. I'm taking one headline, which is, since when is PB&J one of the 4 major food groups, and I'm transforming it into a second headline. It's a very similar headline, and a cynical person on this call might say, well, isn't it really just the same thing? Which technically is true. However, it's technically also not true, because it is not technically the same thing. It is actually different. And we're actually going to take this process and we're going to do some other things with it. We're going to transform these so that we create a total of 4 headlines based off the original headline. A total of 4, including the original one. There's going to be 4. And the reason we do this is because the 4 different versions, the 4 different variations, the 4 different flavors, if you will, sometimes the flavors are only subtly different, but they allow us to have different ways to approach the marketplace. And I can't really tell you why one headline works better than the other. I can't tell you why the question version is more powerful than the statement version, or the statement version is more powerful than the question version. But I can tell you this. Sometimes the question is more powerful than the statement. Sometimes the statement is more powerful than the question. Sometimes it's not a matter of power. It's more just a matter of what is appropriate in the situation. And what I'm trying to do is build myself up enough of an inventory of good headlines that as I go and start to write, I have the ability to choose ones to give me my best opportunity to win, okay? The next part of the transformation process is to take my first-person statements and questions and then turn them into second-person statements and questions. Now, you know the difference between first and second person, right? First person is when you are talking in terms of me, I, we, me, I, and so forth. Second person statements are ones where you say things like you, your, and so forth. Generally speaking, not always, but generally, when you see headlines, they're written in second person format. And what we're going to do is take our first person headlines and transform them into second person headlines, not because second person headlines are inherently better, but because, again, we're just trying to give ourselves some additional flavors and feels for these headlines that may or may not be more useful in given situations, okay? I think first-person headlines can be extraordinarily powerful because they have even higher chance of hitting a direct bullseye on the reticular activator because they're stated in John Smith's first-person format. But that doesn't mean that we can't utilize and have success with some second-person ones. So, well, let me just give you this. This is a key point here. Try hard to maintain the original integrity of the first-person headlines. One of the things that we see people do that messes this up is they'll think of a second-person headline that's a completely different headline than the original first-person headline. What I want you to do is take the first-person headline, whether it was a question and or a statement, and then I want you to turn it into a second person. I'll show you examples, okay? Okay? So, since when is PB&J one of the 4 major food groups? And here's the other version. I wasn't aware that PB&J was one of the 4 major food groups. Remember that? These are the ones that we've already created. Now we're going to transform them into second person. To parents whose daycare seems to think PB&J is one of the 4 major food groups. And now we're going to also put it into a question format. Ready? Does your daycare seem to think PB&J is one of the 4 major food groups? Now, if we look at these 4 headlines, and make no mistake, we've got 4 distinct, unique headlines here. The context of where and when we're trying to write the marketing piece, and by extension using the headline, is going to heavily determine which of the headlines we should use at that particular time. But I think it's fairly clear in this example, this one singular example, and I don't want you to take this singular example and say, well, it's always like that, because it's not. But in this example, can't you see that the 4th headline flows better and is more powerful, generally speaking, than the 3rd? Does your daycare seem to think PB&J is one of the 4 major food groups? Is more powerful than the parents whose daycare seems to think PB&J is one of the 4 major food groups. But we also have some powerful headlines with the 1st and 2nd. So the reason we do this, again, not to be redundant, but just to make sure you understand the point, is we do this to make sure that we've got plenty of variety to choose from when we go to write the marketing piece. All right. It looks like this daycare is background check optional. First person statement, first person question. Do you agree this daycare seems to be background check optional? Some second person statement. Some daycare centers seem to be background check optional. Does your daycare seem to be background check optional? 4 different versions of the original headline. Okay? First person statement. Those daycare workers look nice enough, but they don't really look very trustworthy. Those daycare workers look nice enough, but are they really trustworthy? How to tell if nice-looking daycare workers are actually trustworthy. Wondering if your nice-looking daycare workers are actually trustworthy. Again, 4 different versions of the same thing. Now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to cover it just one last time. You know why? Because I've trained people on this hundreds and hundreds of times, okay? I've been training people on this stuff for the better part of 20 years now. And I know the objections that you have when being trained on this. One of the objections you have is, why do I have to write so many? And you sound just like my kids when I ask them to do some chore. You know, go make your bed. Why do I got to make my bed when I'm just going to get back in it tonight? I don't know, same reason you got to eat food when you're just going to get hungry again. That's just the way it works, okay? The reason you have to write so many headlines, well, first of all, you don't. I mean, you go get in your bed and never make it. I don't really care. But the reason that you have to write these many headlines is because I promise you, some versions of these are going to be more appropriate than others for certain situations, okay? You want to have an inventory. The other objection I get is when people get down here to the second person statement and the second person question, they will find whole different headlines. So they might put, those daycare workers look nice enough, but they don't really look very trustworthy. And then they'll come down here to second person statement and they might say something like, I don't like the tattoos that this daycare worker has. Or, do you not like the tattoos that your daycare worker has? And I go back to them and I say, well, we're not talking about tattoos in this original headline. And they say, well, but it's a good headline. True, it's a good headline. So here's what we would encourage you to do. Take it and write and reverse engineer it back into first person statements and questions and second person statement and questions for that headline, okay? Does that make sense? Let's do another one. I don't want my son to be treated like a number. Will the daycare workers treat my son like a number? How to avoid daycare centers that treat your child like a number. Ever feel like your daycare center treats your child like a number? And again, I think that particular one, the second person question, is pretty darn powerful. My gosh, it looks like they've got Johnny in there with 50 other kids. Could they possibly be putting Johnny in there with 50 other kids? Some daycare centers will cram your child in a class with 50 other kids. Does your daycare cram your child in a class with 50 other kids? Now, you'll notice I've introduced an interesting word into those last 2 headlines. The word is cram. I like that. We might even go back and put it in the first. My gosh, it looks like they've crammed Johnny in there with 50 other kids. Could they possibly be cramming Johnny in there with 50 other kids? That might even be more powerful. But the original structural integrity of the headline has stayed the same, so that's good. Seems like all they do is watch TV and play all day. Are they just playing and watching TV all day at daycare? Beware of daycare centers that stick your child in front of a TV all day. Tired of your child just playing and watching TV all day at daycare. Okay? This is not that complicated. I can't believe Johnny learned all the sitcom theme songs while at daycare. Where did Johnny learn all the theme songs from all the sitcoms? If your child has learned sitcom theme songs while attending daycare, does your idea of learning at daycare include your child learning sitcom theme songs? I'm tired of Johnny complaining that there's nothing to do while at daycare. Why does Johnny always complain about there being nothing to do at daycare? It's a good headline. What to do if your child complains that there's nothing to do at daycare? Tired of your child complaining that there's nothing to do at daycare. Now, I had a point on the slide a few slides ago, and I went over it fairly quickly, and I want to go back and revisit for a second. The second person headlines are more what people traditionally think of when they think of headlines. Most headlines are written in second person. So sometimes these just feel a little bit more comfortable. They feel a little bit more at home. They feel a little bit more like, you know, your favorite sweatshirt that's been worn 150 times and gone through the wash. It just feels a little more comfortable. So sometimes these are going to be good, powerful headlines, okay? But look where we started. We started by taking this directly out of John Smith's brain. Remember? They need enough stuff to keep a bunch of active toddler busy all day. Why don't they have enough stuff to keep a bunch of active toddlers busy all day? Why some daycare centers can't keep active toddlers busy all day? Does your daycare have enough stuff to keep active toddlers busy all day? My Susie is such a picky eater, I'm afraid she'll starve to death at daycare. Susie is such a picky eater. Will she starve to death at daycare? Picky eaters will never starve to death at Tiny Tots daycare. Worried about your picky eater, that your picky eater will starve to death at daycare. Just different ways to say it. Here's what you're going to typically find. That second person statement is usually the hardest to write. And the second person question is usually a little easier to write. Okay? If you're going through this exercise and you're taking a first person statement or question and you're trying to transform it into the other first person statement or question, whichever it wasn't to start with, or into the second person statement or question, if you run into roadblocks, mental roadblocks, and you just can't figure it out, my advice to you is to skip it. Just skip it. There's no requirement to fill all these out. The teacher is not going to check your results, and your admission into higher education is not going to depend on how many boxes out of 4 that you fill out. Now, I hope that over the course of multiple headlines and multiple hot buttons that you can get many headlines, but don't, here's the worst thing you can do is get bogged down and stuck on one particular form of a headline. If you can't figure it out, just move on and don't worry about it. You'll have plenty of headlines if you go through this whole process, okay? Now, the case for volume, we talked about this, creating lots of headlines. Would you rather be this guy, you know, or this guy? And, you know, we want to come fully loaded for bear, right? Now, let's take this to one higher level. Version 2.0, John Smith's statements, okay? Picture John Smith in the situation that's causing him problems. Think of a cartoon. What would he be saying to himself? We already talked about that. Now let's take it up a notch. Close your eyes. Don't close your eyes if you're driving. Imagine yourself in the situation that is causing John Smith problems. Use as much detail as possible. Where are you physically? Where are you located? What is going on around you? What do you see and hear? What do you feel? And then finally, what would John Smith say? Okay, I want you to just literally close your eyes and put yourself in that moment. Now, they say this in sports, right? They say that in sports, visualization is critical. You know, I'm a basketball player. I'm not saying I'm great, and I'm not saying that I'm in the NBA. I'm just saying I enjoy playing. I play in a pickup league, in a city league, and just something I enjoy doing. And I like it enough that I'll think about it, and I'll think about different kinds of shots and moves and things and plays. And even for somebody like myself that is not playing for any kind of result other than fun, it's still a worthwhile process. Think about, okay, if I go this way and I go and I elevate in this shot and the guy comes over to block it, I have these options, and you think through it. Okay, I can pass here, I can go here, I should have a shooter out here on the three-point line, I can try to elevate and shoot this type of a shot, and you think through the situations. Okay, that's sports. And I'm asking you to think through this situation, the John Smith situation, and look at it and feel yourself being in the moment, okay? So let's do this for something that's pretty easy. Plumber. And the hot button is on time. The situation is the plumber's supposed to be there at a certain time, but he's late, which messes up John Smith's schedule. And I want you to put yourself in that situation. So let's pretend like we're at the psychiatrist here. Lay down on the couch, close your eyes, and I want you to talk me through it. How do you feel? Well, here's what you might say. My toilet is overflowing, so I go to the phone book. That's a little outdated. Google, I call a plumber. I really need to get it taken care of fast. I have company coming over tonight. I call a few places. I find one that says they can send somebody right over within an hour. It's 9:15 at the time, so I'm thinking 10 sounds pretty good. At 10:30, I start to get concerned. At 11, I call the company, and they say the plumber got tied up on a job, but he's on his way. At noon, I'm getting PO'd. At 1 o'clock, I'm furious. Finally, at 1:45, I'm really mad because I have to go to my daughter's school because I volunteered for the school party. As I begin to walk out the door, already running late for the school function, the doorbell rings. It's the plumber. Now I have to decide if I should stay, get the toilet fixed, or go to the school function. I decide to stay for the plumber. Shouldn't take long. After 30 minutes, the problem is fixed. I arrive at the school party to find my daughter in tears. I think about the plumber, and I say, now, all I'm trying to do here on this screen, your details could be different. Maybe he showed up just an hour late. Whatever it is. I just want you to think through it so that when you say whatever it is you say, you've got the full weight of the experience bearing down on your soul, okay? Does the plumber expect me to arrange my schedule around his? If you can't come for 5 hours, just tell me so I can make other arrangements. I can understand running 20 or 30 minutes behind, but 4.5 hours with no phone call, unreal. I guess sometime between 9 and 5 is an acceptable window of time for a plumber. And it might be a lot more profanity-laced than that for most of us. Let's do another one. Daycare, diet and nutrition. Child comes home from daycare hungry and irritable because he doesn't like the food, okay? Pick up my kid from school, gets in the car, starts to whine about being hungry. This is very easy for me to understand. I asked Johnny, why is he hungry? Didn't you eat at daycare? He says they had PB&J again, and he doesn't like PB&J, as I well know, and as the school knows. When I ask more, I find out that there were not any other foods available, just peanut butter and jelly. Take it or leave it. Now, my son Johnny left it because he doesn't like it, and he's hungry. I start racing. My mind starts racing. That little ember of anger starts to grow inside me. So what I'm really asking you to do is to think of this situation where your son doesn't like the food that they have. You know that he doesn't like that food. The school knows that they don't like that food. They didn't make anything else available. Your son, being a kid, said, well, the heck with it. I'm just not going to eat it. Now he's really, really hungry. It's 2:45 in the afternoon. You dropped him off there at 8 o'clock in the morning. He hasn't had a thing to eat all day. How are you feeling about that? You pretty excited about that? Feeling pretty good? You want to go give the teacher a pat on the back or more like a punch in the face? Right? Allow it to touch you. Allow it to emotionally put its load on you, okay? We pay $700 a month for daycare, and the best they can do is peanut butter and jelly. Since when is PB&J one of the major food groups? Why on earth isn't there more variety of food for Johnny? You'd think they'd have at least 2 different choices for picky kids. Would it be asking too much to have a warm meal for my kid? All right. Category. Advertising, direct mail. We want to talk about the hot button of category exclusivity. Here's the situation. John Smith is tired of his ad appearing next to all of his competitors' ads and diluting his results. I sell swimming pools, and all the advertising publications I normally advertise in also seem to have all my competitors' ads in there. I'm not getting nearly as many calls as I should, and the advertising is costing me a fortune. For instance, take a look at this magazine. I spent $5,600 for a circulation of 450,000. I've received 3 calls. No wonder. Look at all my competitors' ads in there. My ad is getting buried with all my competitors. I doubt anyone even saw it. Now, here's what I want you to think about for a second. Imagine you were reading an email from an advertising company or a postcard or whatever. And you saw this headline. My ad is getting buried with all my competitors. I doubt anyone even saw it. Now, this is a non-traditional headline. It doesn't sound like a headline you normally hear. But I want you to consider the power that it packs because it's directly hitting this issue, okay? I can't even find my ad in here. No wonder I'm not getting any leads. I have 21 competitors, and dang it, if all 21 of them don't have ads right here next to mine. So what you're telling me is that exclusive categories don't even exist. I wish I could find a way to get rid of all of my competitors' ads so prospects wouldn't even see them. Close your eyes. Imagine yourself in this situation that's causing John Smith problems. Use as much detail as possible. And, let's just do an exercise, okay, for moving. Let's say the company that we're writing marketing for is a moving company. And you have to jump through a bunch of hoops to deal with damaged goods. So let's think about this. I get to my new house. I'm unpacking the boxes. I unpack the box. It's clearly marked fragile. I open it. It doesn't appear to be packed properly. My things are broken. Some of these are heirlooms or priceless or, whatever. They're irreplaceable. I find that they're broken. I start thinking about how much it's going to cost to replace them, and the fact that they are not actually replaceable because they were given to me by my grandmother. What would you say? Okay. Whoops. I guess that's it. That's all we've got. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open this for questions. We've got a lot of people on the call today. If you have any questions, use the question button thingy to type in your question, and we'll talk about it. If you don't have any questions, then we'll be done. This is the methodology. So I'll give you just a minute, and if we've got some people that want to ask some questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we will be done today. That's a good bunch of people we have on the call today. Thanks for participating. I appreciate that. Ask any questions? Examples? Anyone? Bueller? 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 Okay, I don't see any questions. Tim, Bill, Rick, Mike, George, Jim, Kevin, Lois, Ann, Arnie? What about pay-per-click headlines to get attention? Yeah, you can use these for pay-per-click. The biggest challenge with pay-per-click, of course, is you have a limited amount of characters. You got 25 characters for the headline, then you've got 2 lines of 35 characters. But if you can find ones that'll fit, definitely this is something you can experiment with. I would definitely recommend it. It's a good question. Thanks. Any other questions? Nope? Okay. Well, thanks for participating today. I appreciate your time and attention. And let's go write some good headlines. We'll talk to y'all later. Bye now.